My name is Jack McCausland,
My name is Nick Kohlstedt.
and our project is Cities for Pollinators, retrofitting green spaces and city design methodologies to better support insect pollinator activity, health, and biodiversity. So the conversation surrounding the decline of pollinators is one that's persisted for the last 30 plus years, caused by a long list of problems, ranging from invasive pests and diseases, mites, viral and fungal pathogens, pesticides, chemicals, climate change, and more. However, in the scope of this project, thinking locally and thinking about issues specifically within an urban context is the most realistic way of slowly creating change in an environment that will become the future of climate change solutions. So this project is an investigation into the ways that urban areas fail to properly support pollinators, one of the lesser acknowledged but crucial aspects of a functioning green city. It's also a proposal for ways in which cities can apply a system of interventions and policies that give room for pollinator support to actually exist in ways that support them, rather than, for example, dropping them into fragmented pollinator gardens that often are really for people and in non-native bee species. So, as a disclaimer, we're using Knoxville as an example city for these interventions, and additionally acknowledging that the majority of the pollinator species that these interventions are focused on are native bee species. So, an investigation into the following topics surrounding native and solitary bee species reveals cities' inherent general inability to support them. Numerous studies that explore how urban wild bee diversity and community composition are affected by factors like habitat fragmentation and isolation reveal that as the proportion of impervious surfaces increases, habitat management decreases, and plant cover decreases, the species richness of ground nesting bee species also decreases, considering that they require bare patches of dirt to nest. And not only does this create a lack of nesting habitat for bee species, but it can also be connected to public disapproval of these bees when they inevitably find their way into civilian structures and more suburban soil due to a lack of proper nesting habitats. Habitat patch size and fragmentation shows that an increase in smaller habitat patches decrease populations of small bee, social bee, and solitary cavity nesting bee species. There is less of an opportunity for overlap and connection between patches, and additionally, these patches that do exist are not planted in specialization to meet the needs of native bee populations. Most patches in pollinator garden plant lists suit the needs of either surface level ornamental value or non-native plants and non-native bee species in the honeybee, who can easily outcompete native pollinators when designers focus on them over everything. And by undermining the ecosystem service value of pollination for native plant communities with an unfocused and purely ornamental plant list, there's no chance for long-term sustainability and support for native pollinator species. The pollinator species that do find themselves in urban environments not only have to worry about their food source and habitat, but additionally how they're impacted by urban artificial lighting. The prevalence of light pollution can penetrate even the deepest of soil cavity nests, with prolonged exposure to light significantly disrupting the circadian rhythms of pollinator species and impairing their behavior. These disruptions in sleep patterns often are attributed to decreased foraging efficiency and reproductive success, and an unnatural increase in vulnerability to predators. Any urban lighting system that contributes to over 3,000 to 4,000 Kelvin becomes one that emits more of a blue and white light, which then becomes disruptive to pollinators and usually is the case for all lighting systems in cities. Lastly, green infrastructure systems have strong potential to support pollinators, but can oftentimes fall short unless there are intentional design choices that make it so. And despite this, in order for green infrastructure systems to function, they require insect pollination to create diverse plant communities capable of managing stormwater runoff. And while the rest of these issues contribute to the lack of potential for pollination and pollinator support, green infrastructure should not be considered something that cannot support pollinators as much as they do rely on them in order to maintain the health of their natural systems.
This is a plan showing how we plan to implement our strategies to create corridors for pollinators to move through the city and support their health. As we can see, neighborhoods to the north, east, and west already have an adequate level of planting and tree canopy, so the goal is to find a way to connect these areas. By identifying specific locations around the city, we can identify the best way to support these pollinators based on their specific site constraints. The first area we started looking at is at the new construction happening on Cumberland Avenue. We recognize these new buildings as good places for green roofs as they can be integrated into the design of the buildings. The purple zones are buildings that are already built, prime candidates for green roofs to retroactively be placed. Additionally, these green roofs would be good locations for bee motels and hotels, as they are elevated off the ground plane and away from human activity. Additionally, the bees would be better able to respond to the natural cycle of the sun, unobstructed from various other factors. The next intervention strategy would be in riparian zones of nearby creeks. Planting native plants would not only beautify these greenways, but create a unique opportunity to support these water-loving plants with incoming pollinators. The third opportunity these corridors would be is on campus. Although much of campus is already some of the most diverse places in Knoxville, there are opportunities in some parks and unused spaces like medians that can be planted with more native species. In the fort, there's already some amount of planting in the form of yards. However, some sort of incentive at the policy level could be given to homeowners who pledge to plant native pollinator-friendly plants on their property, thereby strengthening the corridor as well as raising property value. The last area for intervention would be along infrastructural ways like roads and train tracks where there's not a lot of human traffic. These small slivers of soil could be utilized to further strengthen green spaces. The following sections are examples of what these interventions might look like. The first is what a riparian intervention might look like along a greenway. Lights at 3000 Kelvin and lower could be used for both safety and pollinator-friendly lighting. Dead wood along the banks could provide habitat for ground nesting species, and native plants such as Joe pieweed and cardinal flowers could be planted for pollinators. This next section shows a basic green roof of a new apartment building. Even something as simple as this could allow for pollinators to interact with native species such as butterfly weeds and coneflowers, unencumbered by human intervention. These spaces also could be used for bee hotels and motels, again with the benefit of being elevated away from people. The final section is an example of somewhere like campus, where bee balm and St. John's wort could be used for both beautification and pollinator support as understory planting for existing shade trees.
So with all these interventions and policy suggestion in mind, there can exist a framework for urban design that truly considers the inclusion and promotion of native pollinator health and improving the capability of Knoxville to be one step closer to a more green city.
Thank you.